The history of Ireland 800-1169 covers the period in the history of Ireland from the first Viking raids to the Norman invasion. The first 2 centuries of this period are characterized by Viking raids and the subsequent Norse settlements along the coast. Viking ports were established at Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, Cork and Limerick, which became the first large towns in Ireland. Ireland consisted of many semi-independent túatha, and during the entire period, attempts were made by various factions to gain political control over the whole of the island. For the first 2 centuries of this period, this was mainly a rivalry between putative High Kings of Ireland from the northern and southern branches of the Uene. The one who came closest to being de facto king over the whole of Ireland, however, was Brian Boru, the first High King in this period not belonging to the Uene. Following Brian's death at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, the political situation became more complex with rivalry for high kingship from several clans and dynasties. Brian's descendants failed to maintain a unified throne, and regional squabbling over territory led indirectly to the invasion of the Normans under Richard de Clare in 1169. Historiography. Due to the rich amount of written sources, the study of Irish history 800-1169 has, to a large extent, focused on gathering, interpretation and textual criticism of these. Only recently have other sources of historical knowledge received more attention, particularly archaeology, since the modern excavations of Dublin started in 1961, followed by similar efforts in Wexford, Waterford and Limerick. Great advances have been made in the understanding of the physical character of the towns established during this period. The first part of the period from 800 to 1014 is well studied. The Viking Age has attracted the interest of historians for quite some time. The period between 1014 and 1169 has received less attention. In the words of Sean Duffy, this period has, historiographically speaking, fallen between 2 stools. Historians of early medieval Ireland, seeking to conclude the narratives on a high note, have traditionally done so after recounting the death of the famous High King Brian Barama at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. On the other hand, historians of later medieval Ireland generally choose to begin proceedings with the English invasion of the 1160s. 11th and early 12th century Ireland has, therefore, often assumed the character of a snappy epilogue or a lengthy prologue. In trying to interpret the history of early Ireland, one of the most frequently asked questions addressed by historians is how early it is possible to speak of an Irish nation, a natio encompassing the whole island of Ireland. Early poet-historians like Flann Maina-Stretch constructed a history of a monarchy of all Ireland going back to and beyond St. Patrick. Only 100 years after Maina-Stretch, Gerald of Wales described the Irish society in his Topography a Hibernica as utterly primitive and savage. At the beginning of modern scholarly interpretation of Irish history, Owen McNeill and G. H. Orpen came to opposite conclusions analyzing the same period. Orpen saw an anarchic country still in a tribal state. He could see no natio, no wider community in Ireland than the tribe. McNeill stressed the reality of the high kingship of Ireland and the existence of many of those institutions of government which Orpen found wanting, and claimed that Irish law had a national character. Political landscape c. 800. At the end of the 8th century, Ireland was homogeneously Gaelic in terms of society, culture and language. People lived in rural communities, and the only larger settlements were monastic towns of varying sizes. The monasteries played an important part in society, not just with regards to religious and cultural life, but also to economy and politics. Christianization had begun in the 5th century, and by the early 9th century the island was almost entirely Christian. However, the martyrology of Tala hints that paganism had not yet been fully uprooted. Owen McNeill identified the oldest certain fact in the political history of Ireland as the existence in late prehistory of a pentarchy, probably consisting of the coisaedra or fifths of the Alade, the Connachtcha, the Lagan, Mumu and Maid, although some accounts discount Maiden's split Mumu in two. This is not an accurate description of the political landscape c. 800, but when discussing the political subdivisions of Ireland at this time, it is still useful to refer to this system. If Lagan and Maid are combined as Leinster, it roughly corresponds with the modern four provinces of Ireland. The Uí divided in two main branches known as Northern Uí and Southern Uí was the leading dynasty in Ireland. The Northern Uí controlled the northwestern part of Ireland, and was divided into two leading branches, the Cene Conel in the west and Cene Neogain, also known as the Kingdom of Ailch. Cene Neogain had become the more powerful of the two in 789, and had expanded east and southwards, gaining control over the important monastic centre Armagh and the large sub-kingdom of Aedula. The traditional kingdom of Alade, dominated by Dalfiatic and Dalnaradi, was now more or less confined to the area east of the River Bann. The central region of Maid had been dominated by what became known as the Southern Uí since the 7th century. Until the 8th century, the Silnarados lane was preeminent, but from 728 the Western dynasty of Clan Charlemagne was dominant. In Lagan, Uí Dunlange was the dominant dynasty c. 800. They were closely associated with the large monastery of Kildare, the main rival for dominance in Leinster. The Uish and Saleg had not been able to claim the title King of Leinster since 728. The Uish and Saleg now controlled the territory in the southeastern part of Leinster, and had close links to the monastery of Ferns. The kingdom of Osriga, occupying roughly the same area as the present County Kilkenny and western County Laois, was considered part of Munster until the late 9th century, when it received an independent status under King Cerbul mac Dunlinge. Munster was dominated by the Eoganacta, centred around Cashel and with Emly as ecclesiastical centre. The Dalgcais had defeated the Cork Druid in 744 and taken control over the area in present County Clare, from which they would later rise to dominance, but were not yet a significant power in Munster. The Eoganacta rivaled the Uí in power and influence, and claimed suzerainty over the southern part of Ireland. This claim was in part anchored within the legendary ancient division of the island in Leith Gwyn and Leith Moga, Cons half, and Mugs half. During the 7th century the Uí Brian had emerged in Connacht, and since the first half of the 8th century being the dominant dynasty, Uí Brian also influenced the kingdom of Brian on the southern borders of the northern Uí First Viking Age. Early Viking raids. The early Vikings were a group of people who originated in modern-day Denmark and Norway. In the 700s, pressure on land in Scandinavia had forced many nobles and warriors to seek land elsewhere. Some of these were younger sons, who stood to inherit nothing of their father's estate. Noblemen with little to lose began to gather together groups of warriors and go down the coast, pillaging settlements. The first recorded Viking raid in Irish history occurred in AD 795 when Vikings, possibly from Norway, looted the island of Lambay. This was followed by a raid on the coast of Braga in 798, and raids on the coast of Connacht in 807. These early Viking raids were generally small in scale and quick. These early raids interrupted the golden age of Christian Irish culture and marked the beginning of 200 years of intermittent warfare, with waves of Viking raiders plundering monasteries and towns throughout Ireland. Most of the early raiders came from the fjords of western Norway. They are believed to have sailed first to Shetland, then south to Orkney. The Vikings would have then sailed down the Atlantic coast of Scotland, and then over to Ireland. During these early raids the Vikings also travelled to the west coast of Ireland to the Skellig Islands located off the coast of County Kerry. The early raids on Ireland seem to have been aristocratic free enterprise, and named leaders appear in the Irish annals. Saxolb in 837, Turges in 845, Egon in 847. Adnide of the Cene Acutil Neogain branch of the northern Uene Acutil became king of Tara in 797, after the death of his predecessor, father-in-law and political rival Donchad Midi. This followed the classic Uene Acutil political arrangement, wherever kingship alternated regularly between Cene Acutil Neogain and Clan Charlemagne of the southern Uene Acutil. During his reign he campaigned in Mide, Leinster and Ulaid to assert his authority, though unlike Donchad he did not campaign in Munster. Thomas Charles Edwards credits AD for the absence of any major Viking attacks on Ireland during his reign after 798. The Annals gives no reference, however, to AD at any time being involved with warfare against Viking raiders. AD was connected to the monastic community at Armagh, and a supporter of the Familia of Patra. His rivals for supremacy within Uene Acutil, the Clan Charlemagne and the Cene Acutil Conel, had on the other hand supported the Familia of Columba. During AD's reign the Columban Familia, following several Viking raids against Iona, established a new monastery at Kells, a royal site in the possession of Armagh. Byrne states that the foundation marked the resolution of any remaining rivalry between the Columban and patrician churches, that the community of Columba in 817 tried to have AD excommunicated may show that not all rivalry was resolved after all. Rivalry between North and South Fadelmad Macrimthen from the Eoganach Chazal acceded to the kingship of Munster in 820, beginning a 130-year domination by this branch of Eoganachta, combining military campaigns with manipulation of ecclesiastical affairs. He embarked on a policy of aggressive expansion to counter the growth in power of the Uene Acutil. Conor Mac Donchada succeeded Adnide as Uene Acutil Overking in 819, and soon found himself challenged by Feidlimid, both by Feidlimid launching raids into Umaid and Connacht and by him interfering in the affairs of Armagh. Conor and Feidlimid met at Birr in 827 to discuss peace terms, and the very fact that the King of Munster could force the High King to a peace conference is indicative of Feidlimid's growing power. Conor was succeeded by Niall Kai in 833. With Niall, we for the first time see a reference in the annals of Uene Acutil leading an army against the Vikings. He defeated Viking raiders in Derry the same year. He sought to further expand Uene Acutil influence in the south. In 835 he led an army to Leinster and installed Bran Mac Fielen as King of Leinster, and also invaded Mide. This brought him into conflict with Feidlimid, however, and in 838 a conference between Niall and Feidlimid was held. This meeting did not result in any lasting peace though. In 840 Feidlimid led an army into Umaid and encamped at Tara, thereby challenging the Uene Acutil also in the north. In 841, however, Fidlimid was routed in battle by Niall in Leinster. His successors in the south would not be able to challenge the north again to this extent until some 150 years later. Intensified raiding in the first Viking settlements in Ireland. The Viking raids on Ireland resumed in 821, and intensified during the following decades. The Vikings were beginning to establish fortified encampments, long ports, along the Irish coast and overwintering in Ireland instead of retreating to Scandinavia or British bases. The first known long ports were at Lindúshall and Dublin. They were also moving further inland to attack, often using rivers such as the Shannon, and then retreating to the coastal bases. The raiding parties also increased in size, becoming regular armies. In 837 the Annals report a fleet of 60 longships on the Liffey, carrying 1.50 men. One of the first named Viking leaders was Thorgest. The annals of the Four Masters connect him with attacks on Connacht, Mide and the church at Clonmacnoise in 844. He was captured and drowned in Loch Alb by Mael Secnal Mac Mael Ruinade, king of Mide. In 848 the Norse army was defeated at Syathnechten by Ulchober Mac Synod of Munster and Lorcan Mac Seleg of Leinster. For the first time the leader of the Vikings is described as royalty from Lochlan. Mael Secnal, now High King, defeated another army at Forart the same year. These victories form the background of an embassy sent to the Frankish Emperor Charles the Bald, reported in the Anne Albertiniani. In 853 Olaf, identified as son of the King of Lochlan, came to Ireland. Lochlan has been understood as present Norway. It is now considered more plausible that it refers to a Scandinavian colony in the Western Isles of Scotland. Olaf assumed leadership of the Vikings in Ireland, probably in some way shared with his kinsman Ivar, first mentioned in the Irish Annals in 857. Olaf and Ivar remained active in Ireland and around the Irish Sea for the next 2 decades. The descendants of Ivar, the Uima, would be an important political factor for the next 2 centuries. Shifting alliances and struggle for power. A significant new trait from the middle of the 9th century was that the Norse now also entered alliances with various Irish rulers. Cerbhal mac Dunlange had become king of Osriga in 842. Cerbhal had defeated Viking raiders in 846 and 847, but from 858 he is allied with Olaf and Ivar against Mael Secnal, campaigning in Leinster and Munster, and in 859 also raiding Mael Secnal's heartlands in Mide, though Cerbhal had to submit to Mael Secnal later the same year. These alliances were by no means permanent. In 860 Cerbhal was allied with Mael Secnal in a campaign against Findliath of the northern Ui Edia Cutdil, while Olaf and Ivar has allied themselves with Aed. In 870, however, Cerbhal and Aed appeared as allies in Leinster. Mael Secnal had more success as High King than his predecessors Niall Kai and Conor Don Charda in dealing with the south, and forced Munster into submission in 858 and is noted above Osriga in 859. He also asserted control over Ulaid, Leinster and Connacht, and was in his obituary in the Annals of Ulster described as Etcher in Uile, King of all Ireland. The last years of his reign he had however experienced serious opposition from his Uine Cutdil kinsmen of Ilch and Brega, allied with the Norse of Dublin. Burn notes. Wenceslas' unprecedented success in achieving the high kingship of all Ireland was marred by the chronic complaint of Irish politics. Having united the Allied Munster, Osriga, Connacht and Leinster, he was attacked at the end of his reign by a combination of acute ill kings. Findlaeth was king of Ilch and the leading king within the northern acute ill. After the death of Wenceslas, he is counted in the regal lists as High King, following the established scheme where this alternated between acute Neogain in the north and Clan Charmain of Mild. His kingship was disputed though, and he did not come close to being an actual king over Ireland. He could count some successes against the Norse, however, most notably burning all the Norse longports in the north in 866. Seems to have used the opportunity while Olaf was involved in warfare in Pictland, presumably bringing a large contingent of the Norse forces in Ireland with him. The Vikings never managed to establish permanent settlements in the north. O'Carraine observes, ironically, success may have held back the economic development of the north and ultimately prevented the growth of port towns like those on the east and south coasts, on which the Leinster and Munster kings subsequently depended for much of the wealth. The last report of Olaf is when he and Ivar returned to Dublin in 871 from Alba. Ivar died in 873. In his obituary, the Annals of Ulster call Ivar king of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain. With the disappearance, there were frequent changes of leadership among the Norse in Ireland and a great deal of internecine conflict is reported for the following decades. In 902 Maelfinia mac Flanacane of Braga and Serbor mac Muircane of Leinster joined forces against Dublin, and the heathens were driven from Ireland, from the fortress of Athclyle. Impact on cultural activity and formation of Irish scholarly diaspora. Historians debate the consequences that the initial phases of Viking settlement had on scholarship and literary output. Scholarly activity, for which the Irish are famous in the early medieval period, consisted of the writing of poetry, the production of Christian devotional texts, the development of the science of computers, and the compilation of elaborate law tracts. Patronage for scholars and scholarship came largely from Irish kings who regarded the presence of court scholars as part and parcel of the trappings of kingship, but also as a means of bolstering their own image through praise poetry that such scholars composed and performed. With the advent of the Vikings, patronage ties have been argued to have been loosened, thereby affecting directly the livelihood of Irish scholars. In addition, some kings would have turned their attention to more pressing pursuits, such as engaging in warfare or alliances with Vikings or other Irish kings, as well as tapping the economic benefits that Viking trade would have brought. While this was happening in Ireland, we observe a more pronounced presence of Irish scholars in Frankish Europe, and especially in circles associated with the Carolingian court, commonly known as peregrini. Irish scholars such as John Scotus Erasgina and Sir Julius Scotus became among the most prominent and influential in 9th-century continental Europe, studying and teaching a range of subjects, from theology to political philosophy. It is tempting to link the presence on the continent as well as the presence of scores of other Irish learned people with the impact of the Vikings on Ireland, which may have driven such people to seek employment elsewhere. If one accepts this version of events, then the Vikings can be said to have inadvertently been one of the principal catalysts for the spread of Irish culture abroad and the subsequent foundation of Irish centres on the continent, which remained influential for centuries to come. Second Viking Age. After having been forced to leave Dublin in 902, the descendants of Ivar, now described in the annals as Uima, remained active around the Irish Sea. There are reports of their activities in Pictland, Strathclyde, Northumbria and Man. In 914 a new Viking fleet appeared in Waterford harbour, and soon the Uimare followed, again taking control over Viking activities in Ireland. Ragnall arrived with a fleet in Waterford, while Sitric landed at Cenfuait in Leinster. Niall Glundub had followed Flancinner's Uene Overking in 916, and he marched into Munster against Ragnall, but no decisive engagement followed. The men of Leinster under Áge mac Éileachta attacked Sithric, but were heavily defeated in the Battle of Confey. This victory allowed Sithric to re-establish Norse control over Dublin. Ragnall left Ireland again in 918, and became King of York, with Sithric in Dublin and Ragnall in York. A Dublin-York axis had been established which would have influence on both England and Ireland for the next half a century. A new and more intensive period of settlement in Ireland began in 914. Between 914 and 922, Waterford, Cork, Dublin, Wexford and Limerick were established. Significant excavations in Dublin and Waterford in the 20th century have unearthed much of the Viking heritage of those cities. The Vikings founded many other coastal towns, and after several generations of coexistence and intermarriage, a group of mixed Irish and Norse ethnic background arose. This Norse influence is reflected in the Norse-derived names of many contemporary Irish kings, and DNA evidence in some residents of these coastal cities to this day. A genetics paper in 2006 by Dr. Brian McAvoy found that most men with Irish Viking surnames carried typically Irish genes. This suggests that Viking settlements may have had a Scandinavian elite, but with most of the inhabitants being indigenous Irish. Niall Glundub marched on Dublin in September 919, but his forces were met by Sitric Island Bridge and suffered a decisive defeat, with Niall and numerous other Irish leaders among the casualties. Dublin was secured for the Norse, and in 920 Sitric left for York and following Ragnall's death succeeded him as ruler there in 921. Their kinsman Gofraid assumed control of Dublin. Gofraid was active as a Viking raider and slaver, but there were signs during his reign that the Norse were not just mere Vikings anymore. During a raid at Armagh in 921, Gofraid spared the prayer houses, and the sick from destruction, considerations never taken by the raiders of the previous century. Another was the intense campaigns led by Dublin and eastern Ulster from 921 to 927, where the purpose seems to have been conquest in order to create a Scandinavian kingdom like the one on the eastern side of the Irish Sea. Dublin's ambitions in Ulster were halted by a series of defeats inflicted upon them by Muirchertach mac Éileachta, the son of Niall Glundub. According to Benjamin Hudson, Muirchertach was one of the most successful generals of his day and was described as the Hector of the Irish. In the annals, it is Donchad Don from Clan Charmaine who was titled High King after Niall. However, Muirchertach did not succeed his father as King of Ailchida until 938. Apart from his victories over the Norse, Muirchertach led campaigns forcing other provincial kingdoms into submission, most notably taking the King of Munster Selichan Caisil captive in 941. The same year he led a fleet to the Hebrides, collecting tribute there. When Sitric died in 927, Gofraid left for York, trying to assume kingship there. He was driven out by Athelstan, and returned to Dublin half a year later. The Vikings of Limerick had taken Dublin in his absence. Gofraid retook the city, but the struggle between Limerick continued well after Gofraid's death in 934. He was succeeded by his son, Amlabe, who inflicted a decisive defeat on Limerick in 937. The same year Amlabe went to Northumbria and allied himself with Constantine II of Scotland and Owen of Strathclyde. This coalition was defeated by Athelstan at Brunumber, but after Athelstan's death in 939 Amlabe was made King of York. He was joined by kinsmen with the same name, Amlabe son of Cetric, known as Amlabe Gwaran. Congalach MacMailmithig, known as Snogba, succeeded Doncha Donnas Uene Acutil Overking in 944. Congalach was king of Braga and a member of Silnarado Slain, and the first of this dynasty called High King, since Synod Macugleg in the early 8th century. In 944 he sacked Dublin, now ruled by Blackhair MacGofrath. When Amlabe Gwaran returned to Ireland the next year, he became ruler of Dublin and acted as an ally of Congalach in the struggle against Rua Idri Ua Cananan, a rival Uene Acutil claimant for high kingship from Cene Acutil Conail. This alliance did not last long after Rua Idri's death in 950, however, and Congalach was killed in 956 in a battle against an alliance of Dublin and Leinster. He was succeeded by Domnall Uane Acutil, and in the following decades alliances shifted constantly between the different branches of Uane Acutil, Leinster and Dublin. In 980 Maelsecnal Mac Domnall succeeded Domnall, and the same year he defeated the forces of Dublin at the Battle of Tara. Following this victory Maelsecnal forced Dublin into submission, and his half-brother Amlabe's son Glunian became ruler in Dublin.